They Shoot Russians, Chapter 2. When you're wounded and left on Afghanistan's plains, and the women come out to cut up what remains, just roll to your rifle and blow out your brains, and go to your God like a soldier. Rudyard Kipling, The Young British Soldier. Less than 6 months before the outbreak of the First World War, my grandmother, Margaret Fisk, gave my father, William, a 360-page book of imperial adventure. Tom Graham, V.C., A Tale of the Afghan War, presented to Willie by his mother, is written in thick pencil inside the front cover. Date Saturday, 24th January 1914, for another, Willie. Willie would have been almost 15 years old. Only after my father's death in 1992 did I inherit this book with its handsome engraved hardboard cover embossed with a British Victoria Cross for valor, it says on the metal, and on the spine a soldier in red coat and peaked white tropical hat with a rifle in his hand. I never found out the meaning of the cryptic reference for another, but years later I read the book, an adventure by William Johnston, and published in 1900 by Thomas Nelson and Sons. It tells the story of the son of a mine owner who grows up in the northern English port of Seaton and forced to leave school and become an apprentice clerk because of his father's sudden impoverishment, joins the British Army under age. Tom Graham is posted to a British unit at Buttevant in County Cork in the southwest of Ireland. He even kisses the Blarney Stone, conferring upon himself the supposed powers of persuasive eloquence contained in that much blessed rock, and then travels to India and to the Second Afghan War, where he is gazetted a second lieutenant in the Highland Regiment. As he stands at his late father's grave in the local churchyard before leaving for the army, Tom vows that he will lead a pure, clean, and upright life. The story is typical of my father's generation, a rip-roaring, racist story of British heroism and Muslim savagery. But reading it, I was struck by some remarkable parallels. My own father, Bill Fisk, the Willie of the dedication almost a century ago, was also taken from school in a northern English port because his father, Edward, was no longer able to support him. He too became an apprentice clerk in Birkenhead. In the few notes he wrote before his death, Bill recalled that he had tried to join the British Army under age. He traveled to Fulwood Barracks in Preston to join the Royal Field Artillery on 15th of August 1914, 11 days after the start of Britain's involvement in the First World War. Successful in enlisting 2 years later, Bill Fisk too was sent to a battalion of the Cheshire Regiment in Cork in Ireland, not long after the 1916 Easter Rising. There is even a pale photograph of my father in my archives, kissing the Blarney Stone. 2 years later, in France, my father was gazetted a second lieutenant in the King's Liverpool Regiment. Was he consciously following the life of the fictional Tom Graham? The rest of the novel is a disturbing tale of color prejudice, xenophobia, and outright anti-Muslim hatred during the Second Afghan War. In the second half of the 19th century, Anglo-Russian rivalry and suspicion had naturally focused upon Afghanistan, whose unmarked frontiers had become the indistinct front lines between Imperial Russia and the British Indian Raj, the principal victims of the Great Game. As British diplomats injudiciously referred to the successive conflicts in Afghanistan, there was indeed something characteristically childish about the jealousy between Russia and Britain, were of course the Afghans. Their landlocked box of deserts and soaring mountains and dark green valleys for centuries been both a cultural meeting point between the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Far East, and a battlefield. A decision by the Afghan king Sher Ali Khan, the third son of Afghanistan's first king, Dost Muhammad, to receive a Russian mission in Kabul after his reaccession in 1868 led directly to what the British were to call the Second Afghan War. The First Afghan War had led to the annihilation of the British Army in the Kabul Gorge in 1842, in the same dark crevice through which I drove at night on my visit to Osama bin Laden in 1997. At the Treaty of Gandamak in 1879, Sher Ali's son, Yaqub Khan, agreed to allow a permanent British embassy to be established in Kabul, but within 4 months, the British envoy and his staff were murdered in their diplomatic compound. The British Army was sent back to Afghanistan. And there is an asterisk after their landlocked box of deserts and soaring mountains and dark green valleys had for centuries been both a cultural meeting point between the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Far East, and a battlefield asterisk. That asterisk says, in a battlefield, Alexander the Great smashed through the Afghan tribes on his way to India, and the land was subsequently ruled by the Kushans, the Persian Sasanians, the Hephthalites, and then the Islamic armies whose initial conquests and occupation were fiercely resisted by the Hindu tribes. Genghis Khan invaded in 1219 and was so infuriated by the death of his grandson outside the besieged city of Bamiyan, where 2 giant 600-year-old Buddhas could clearly be seen, cut into the cliffs above the valley, that he ordered his Mongol army to execute every man, woman, and child. Other empires were to extend their territory into what is now called Afghanistan. At the end of the 14th century, Timur-Ilang, Timur the Club-Footed, the Tamburlaine of Christopher Marlowe's blood-boltered play, conquered much of the land. The Timurids were succeeded by the Mughals of India and the Safavids of Persia. There were periodic rebellions by Afghan tribes, but the outlines of a country that could be identified as Afghanistan only emerged in 1747, when the leader of a minor Pushtun tribe, Ahmad Shah Durrani, formed a confederacy that subsequently invaded the north of India. Only under Dost Muhammad in the 1830s did Afghanistan take on the appearance of a single political nation. This is the picture that comes with it. In Bill Fisk's novel, Tom Graham goes with them in the bazaar in Peshawar, now in Pakistan, then in India. Graham encounters Pathan tribesmen, a villainous lot. Most of the fanatics wore the close-fitting skull cap, which gives such a diabolical aspect to its wearer. Within days, Graham is fighting the same tribesmen at Pewar Kotal, driving his bayonet up to the nozzle into the chest of an Afghan, a swarthy giant, his eyes glaring with hate. In the Karam Valley, Graham and his chums, a word my father used about his comrades in the First World War, fight off infuriated tribesmen, drunk with the lust of plunder. When General Sir Frederick Roberts, later Lord Roberts of Kandahar, agrees to meet a local tribal leader, the man arrives with as wild a looking band of rascals as could be imagined. The author notes that whenever British troops fell into Afghan hands, their bodies were dreadfully mutilated and dishonored by the fiends in human form. When the leader of the Afghans, deemed responsible for the murder of the British envoy, is brought for execution, a thrill of satisfaction goes through the ranks of Graham's comrades as the condemned man faces the gallows. Afghans are thus a villainous lot, fanatics, rascals, fiends in human form, meat for British bayonets, or toasting forks, as the narrative cheerfully calls them. It gets worse. A British artillery officer urges his men to fire at close-packed Afghan tribesmen with the words, that will scatter the flies. The text becomes not only racist, but anti-Islamic. Boy readers, the author pontificates, may not know that it was the sole object of every Afghan engaged in the war of 1878 to 1880 to cut to pieces every heretic he could come across. The more pieces cut out of the unfortunate Britisher, the higher his summit of bliss in paradise. After Tom Graham is wounded in Kabul, the Afghans, in the words of his Irish-born army doctor, have become murtherin' villains, the black N-words. When the British suffer defeat at the Battle of Maiwand on a grey desert west of Kandahar, an officer orders his men to have your bayonets ready and wait for the N-words. There is no reference in the book to the young Afghan woman, Malalai, who, seeing the Afghans briefly retreating, tore her veil from her head and led a charge against her enemies, only to be cut down by British bullets. That, of course, is part of Afghan, not British history. When victory is finally claimed by the British at Kandahar, Tom Graham wins his Victoria Cross. From villains to flies and N-words in 100 pages. It's not difficult to see how easily my father's world of pure, clean, and upright Britons bestialized its enemies. Though there are few references to the boldness of Afghan tribesmen, and just one to their courage, no attempt is made to explain their actions. They are evil, hate-filled, anxious to prove their Muslim faith by cutting pieces out of the unfortunate Britisher. The notion that Afghans do not want foreigners invading and occupying their country simply does not exist in the story. If official British accounts of Afghanistan were not so prejudiced, they nevertheless maintained the oversimplified and supremacist view of the Afghans that Johnston used to such effect in his novel. An account of life in Kabul between 1836 and 1838 by Lieutenant Colonel Sir Alexander Burnes of the East India Company, published the year of the massacre of the British Army in 1842, gives a sensitive portrayal of the generosity of tribal leaders and demonstrates a genuine interest in Afghan customs and social life. But by the end of the century, the official Imperial Gazetteer of India chooses to describe the animals of Afghanistan before it reports on its people, who are handsome and athletic, inured to bloodshed from childhood, treacherous and passionate in revenge, ignorant of everything connected with their religion beyond its most elementary doctrines. Among the young Britons who accompanied the army of Kabul in 1879, a real Briton this time, was 29-year-old civil servant Henry Mortimer Durand, who had been appointed political secretary to General Roberts. In horror, he read the general's proclamation to the people of Kabul, declaring the murder of the British mission diplomats a treacherous and cowardly crime which has brought indelible disgrace upon the Afghan people. The followers of Yaqub Khan, General Roberts declared, would not escape, and their punishment should be such as will be felt and remembered. All persons convicted of bearing a part in the murders will be dealt with according to their deserts. It was a Victorian version of the warning that an American president would give to the Afghans 122 years later. Durand, a humane and intelligent man, confronted Roberts over his proclamation. It seemed to me so utterly wrong in tone and in matter that I determined to do my utmost to overthrow it. The stilted language and the absurd affectation of preaching historical morality to the Afghans, all our troubles with whom began by our own abominable injustice, made the paper, to my mind, most dangerous for the general's reputation. Roberts ameliorated the text, not entirely to Durand's satisfaction. He thought it merely a little less objectionable. Yet Durand sent a letter to his biographer's sister, Ella Sykes, which provided gruesome evidence that Tom Graham contained all too real descriptions of Afghan cruelty. During the action of the Chardey Valley on the 12th of December, 1879, he wrote almost 16 years after the event, 2 squadrons of the 9th Lancers were ordered to charge a large force of Afghans in the hope of saving our guns. The charge failed, and some of our dead were afterwards found dreadfully mutilated by Afghan knives. I saw it all. But Durand was well aware that the Afghans were not the fiends in human form of popular fiction. In 1893, he describes the Afghan army commander Ghulam Haider as an inquisitive and generous man. Today we talked about the size of London and how it was supplied with food, about religious prejudices, the hatred of Sunnis and Shias, the Reformation and the Inquisition, the Mussulman. and the Muslim men and Christian stories of Christ's life and death, the Spanish Armada, Napoleon and his wars, about which Ghulam Hyder knew a good deal, the manners of the Somalis, tiger shooting, etc. Durand had been sent to negotiate with the Afghan king Abdur Rahman, a nephew of Sher Ali, over the southern border of his country to secure an agreed frontier between British India and Afghanistan. Durand's brother Edward had already helped to delineate the country's northern frontier with Russia, during which the Russians sent a force of Cossacks to attack Afghan troops on the Kushk River, and Mortimer Durand found the king deeply unsympathetic to his northern neighbor. According to Durand's notes, Abdur Rahman announced that, "Unless you drive me into an enmity, I am your friend for my life." And why? The Russians want to attack India. You do not want to attack Russian Turkmenistan. Therefore, the Russians want to come through my country, and you do not. People say I would join with them to attack you. If I did, and they won, would they leave my country? Never. I would be their slave, and I hate them. 86 years later, the Russians would find out what this meant.